The Kellogg family made billions from your breakfast, but the familiar cornflakes have an origin no one expects. It was created to suppress sexual desire. This family was founded by two brothers, John Harvey Kellogg, a famous surgeon and a devoutly religious man. John believed that self-abuse was the root of all illness. He invented the bland cereal as a medical prescription, a prescription to cleanse the body. The other was Will Keith Kellogg, the pragmatic younger brother, lived his entire life looked down on by his brother. Will didn't care about saving souls. He cared about profit. Will stole his brother's invention. He did one thing that was absolutely forbidden. He added sugar. This is the truth about the Kellogg's. An unforgiving war between two brothers, a war born from jealousy and fanaticism, and it permanently changed America's breakfast. The food that cured sin. The Kellogg dynasty and the entire American cereal industry was born from the unlikely combination of religious fervor and gastrointestinal distress. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, a new American religion that emerged in the mid-19th century, was defined by its belief that the second coming of Christ was imminent. Its co-founder and prophet, Ellen G. White, taught that to prepare their souls for this event, Adventists must first purify their bodies. This health reform movement, as she called it, was a radical holistic doctrine. White preached that the body was a temple for the Holy Spirit. To defile it with meat, alcohol, caffeine, or tobacco was a sin. She advocated for a strict vegetarian diet, hydrotherapy, and, most critically, a rejection of the era's heavy, greasy, meat-based breakfasts. In 1866, the Adventists opened a small, struggling clinic in Battle Creek, Michigan, to practice these principles. It was called the Western Health Reform Institute. For 10 years, it languished, run by well-meaning but medically untrained believers. The first Kellogg to enter this world was John Harvey Kellogg. Born in 1852, John was the brilliant, eccentric, and favored son of a local Adventist family. He was a protege of Ellen G. White herself. She saw in the young, intensely ambitious John the perfect instrument to bring medical legitimacy to her faith. The church elders pooled their money and paid for John's medical education at the finest schools in the country. In 1876, the 24-year-old Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, now a fully credentialed surgeon, returned to Battle Creek and was given total control of the Health Institute. He immediately renamed it the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and he transformed it from a small clinic into a world-famous multi-million-dollar health spa. The San, as it was known, was not a hospital. It was a theocracy of health, and Dr. John was its pope. He was a whirlwind of energy, a brilliant surgeon, a tireless inventor, and a charismatic showman. He expanded the San from a 20-patient farmhouse into a 1,200-patient luxury resort, a palace of hydrotherapy, exercise, and biologic living. The rich and famous flocked to him, presidents, titans of industry like Henry Ford, movie stars, and European royalty. They came to Battle Creek to be cured by his radical and often bizarre methods. Dr. John's philosophy was a strict, medicalized interpretation of Adventist doctrine. He believed that almost all human illness, from consumption to insanity, was caused by one thing: auto-intoxication originating in the gut. The 19th century American diet, heavy in salted meats, fats, and alcohol, was, in his view, rotting in the colons of the populace, creating poisons that seeped into the bloodstream. But Dr. John, as detailed in his 500,000-copy bestseller Plain Facts for Old and Young, was also obsessed with a more sinful source of illness: masturbation. He was a product of the Victorian era's medical hysteria surrounding sexuality. He fanatically believed that self-abuse was the great polluting evil of the age, a habit that led to insanity, epilepsy, blindness, and the total decay of the vital force. His entire sanitarium regime was designed to combat these two evils. He prescribed rigorous, exhausting exercise. He developed hydrotherapy, subjecting his wealthy patients to dozens of different, often torturous, water treatments, ice-cold enemas, high-pressure douches, and perpetual baths. And most importantly, he prescribed a bland, vegetarian diet. His goal was to create food that was anaphrodisiacal, food so pure, so unstimulating, that it would not inflame the animal passions. This was the central quest of his life, to invent a food that was easily digestible and so bland it would act as a spiritual and physical anti-aphrodisiac. For years, his patients were forced to eat his first invention, Zwieback, a rock-hard, twice-baked bread that had to be soaked in water just to be chewed. It was food as penance. While Dr. John was building his medical empire, his younger brother, Will Keith Kellogg, was living in his shadow. Born in 1860, Will was the failure of the family. He lacked his brother's dazzling intellect and charisma. He dropped out of school and in 1880 took a menial $6 a week job at his older brother's sanitarium. He was, in effect, John's personal servant, handyman, and business manager. For the next 26 years, Will Kellogg's life was one of quiet, constant humiliation. Dr. John, the king of Battle Creek, treated his younger brother with open contempt. He called him Willie, the flunky, or just the janitor. Will was forced to run every errand, from bookkeeping and managing the mailroom to, as he would later bitterly recall, taking notes for Dr. John while the doctor was on the toilet. He was never given credit, rarely given a raise, and constantly mocked for his lack of a formal education. He was a gray, silent, mustachioed man, shuffling through the halls of his brother's palace, his pockets filled with notebooks, his mind filled with a simmering, decades-long resentment. Will was not a visionary. He was a pragmatist. He ran the sanitarium's massive multi-million-dollar business operations with meticulous, penny-pinching efficiency, while his brother, the genius, spent money wildly on new exercise machines and grand expansions. And crucially, Will was the one who managed the Battle Creek Toasted Flake Company, the small side business that produced the sanitarium's patented health foods. He was the one who had to deal with the complaints about the rock-hard Zwieback. In 1894, this resentment and this practicality collided to create a happy accident. Dr. John was, as usual, obsessed with creating a new, digestible wheat-based food. He and Will were experimenting in the sand kitchen. They had boiled a batch of wheat, but were then called away on urgent business. When they returned, days later, the boiled wheat had begun to ferment slightly. They were about to throw it out, but Will, the frugal manager, insisted they try to salvage it by running it through the rollers, as they always did. But instead of forming a single gummy sheet of dough, the fermented wheat, when rolled, broke apart into dozens of large, thin, individual flakes. Intrigued, they took these flakes and baked them in the ovens. The result was a light, crispy, and surprisingly palatable toasted flake. It was a massive improvement on the jaw-breaking Zwieback. Dr. John was thrilled. He had found his perfect medical food. It was easy to digest, and it was perfectly sinfully bland. He called them Granose flakes. But the story didn't end there. According to company legend, the brothers soon tried the same process with corn. The cornflake was born. It was even crispier and had a more appealing nutty flavor. Dr. John filed for a patent on the flaking process in 1895 in his name only, and began serving the toasted flakes to his patients. The flakes were a sensation. Patients at the SAN, who were used to being punished by their food, were suddenly being served something they actually enjoyed. They began smuggling boxes of the flakes home with them. A small but growing mail-order business began, run by the ever-efficient Will. One of those patients was a struggling, ambitious 40-year-old businessman from Texas named Charles W. Post. C.W. Post had come to the sanitarium in 1891, a broken man suffering from a nervous breakdown and chronic digestive issues. He was a patient of Dr. John's for nearly a year. He ate the bland food, he took the water cures, and he listened intently to Dr. John's lectures on health, digestion, and the vast untapped market for clean foods. Post was not cured by the sanitarium. He left in disgust, but he had in fact been cured. He had found his calling. He was not a patient. He was an opportunist. He had just completed a year-long immersive market research study, paid for by his own illness. In 1895, C.W. Post founded the Post Cereal Company, just down the road in Battle Creek. He was not an inventor. He was a brilliant thief and marketer. He launched his first product, Postum, a roasted grain coffee substitute based on a health drink he'd had at the sanitarium. Then, in 1897, he launched his masterpiece, Grape Nuts. It was a crunchy, pebbly, twice-baked biscuit, a direct and far more marketable ripoff of Dr. John's Zwieback. While Dr. John was busy healing the wealthy, C.W. Post was busy selling to the masses. He was a marketing genius, an early pioneer of the power of suggestion. His ads for grape nuts were pseudo-scientific masterpieces of quackery. He claimed with no evidence that his cereal could cure appendicitis, strengthen the brain, and was a road to Wellville. Back at the sanitarium, Will Kellogg watched with growing agonizing frustration. C.W. Post was becoming a millionaire by selling a worse version of their products. Then, Post struck again. In 1904, he launched Elijah's Manna, a new sweetened cereal. It was a toasted cornflake. He had stolen their greatest invention. The product was later renamed Post Toasties. The cereal war had begun, and the Kellogg's were losing because they weren't even on the field. Will Kellogg, now 45 years old, a gray-haired flunky, finally snapped. He saw C.W. Post becoming the cereal king of America with his products. He went to his brother, Dr. John, and begged him, pleaded with him, to let him take their cornflake, the original and better one, and sell it to the American public. Dr. John was horrified. This was the great cataclysmic split that would define the dynasty. It was a war between the prophet and the pragmatist. Dr. John's entire philosophy was based on the Adventist ideal of health and purity. His food was medicine. It was supposed to be bland. The idea of selling it to the unclean masses as a commercial product instead of a medical one was bad enough. But Will had an even more heretical proposal. He had been secretly experimenting in the kitchen. He had discovered that if he added a small amount of sugar to the cornflake, it tasted infinitely better. It was the key. Sugar would make it a national sensation. To Dr. John, this was not just a recipe change, it was a mortal sin. Sugar, in the Adventist and Kelloggite view, was an irritant, a stimulant that inflamed the very animal passions he was trying to cure. It was, in his view, no better than alcohol or caffeine. He flatly refused. He would not have his sacred medical anti-masturbatory food polluted with sugar. This was the moment. Will Kellogg, after 26 years of humiliation, finally defied his brother. He had saved a little of his own money. He found his own investors. And in 1906, he broke away from the sanitarium, from his brother, and from the Adventist faith. He founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. His first act of liberation, his first great act of rebellion against his brother, was to add the sugar. Dr. John was apoplectic. He was furious, not just that Will had stolen his product, but that he had perverted it. He immediately sued his brother. This began a 12-year legal war between John and Will over the one thing they still shared, their own last name. Dr. John, who had also created a small competing Battle Creek food company, claimed that he was the real Kellogg, and that Will's new sugar-coated devil's food had no right to bear the family name. Will, who had spent his entire life being told he wasn't a real Kellogg, now fought with the desperation of a man claiming his own identity. The cereal war was now a two-front war. Will Kellogg was fighting a public commercial war against his great rival, C.W. Post, and he was fighting a private, bitter, legal war against his own brother, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. This was the toxic fraternal crucible that created the Kellogg's empire, an empire born from a bizarre religious obsession with digestion and sin, stolen by a rival, and then perfected by a younger brother in an act of profound personal and commercial rebellion. Who really owned the Kellogg's name? The year 1906 was the moment the Kellogg dynasty split in two, dividing the worlds of health and commerce forever. When Will Keith Kellogg walked out of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, he was 46 years old, a man who had spent 26 years as the gray, invisible, and humiliated flunky to his older, superstar brother. He was a man who had been mocked, underpaid, and systematically denied credit for his work. His rebellion was not just a business decision, it was a profound act of personal secession. He was a man claiming his own life. He founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company on a single heretical idea. And he, the younger brother, was the only one who understood it. His brother, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, had invented the cornflake for a divine purpose, to be an anaphrodisiac. It was a medical food, designed to be so bland that it would cure the sin of masturbation and calm the digestive tract. Will's great revolutionary idea was sugar. He had secretly experimented in the sanitarium kitchens, discovering that adding a light dusting of sugar to the flakes transformed them. It turned the penance into a pleasure. It took a medical prescription and made it a breakfast food. To Dr. John, this was not just a recipe change. It was a mortal sin. Dr. John was a fanatic, a true believer in the Seventh-day Adventist health gospel of Ellen G. White. In his pseudo-scientific worldview, sugar was a stimulant, an irritant, no different from caffeine, nicotine, or alcohol. He believed it inflamed the animal passions and polluted the soul, the very things his entire life's work was designed to fight. He flatly refused. He would not have his sacred medical anti-masturbatory food polluted with sugar. This was the final schism. Will Kellogg, the pragmatist, was done with his brother's religious dogma. He saw the future, and the future, he knew, was sweet. His new company, funded by his own meager savings and a few wary Battle Creek investors, was founded on this single act of rebellion. His first act of liberation, his first great act of rebellion against his brother, was to add the sugar. His second was to prepare for war. The cereal wars were not one war, but two. The first was a public, commercial war for the American breakfast table waged against the marketing genius C.W. Post. The second was a private, bitter, and far more brutal war waged against his own brother, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, for control of the family name. The battle with his brother began almost immediately. Dr. John was apoplectic. He was furious that Will was using his invention, but he was absolutely enraged that he was doing it under the Kellogg name. Dr. John, the king of Battle Creek, the most famous surgeon in America, believed that he was Kellogg. Will was just the janitor who had stolen the formula. In 1907, Dr. John sued his own brother. This kicked off a vicious 12-year legal war that would consume both men and cost a fortune. The central question of the lawsuit was simple: who owned the name Kellogg? Dr. John's argument was one of pure ego and invention. He claimed rightly that he was the inventor. He was the world-famous Dr. Kellogg of the sanitarium. He had created the Kellogg brand of health foods, which he sold through his own much smaller Battle Creek Food Company. He argued that Will's new sugar-coated poison was a counterfeit and a fraudulent use of his good name. He publicly and repeatedly called Will a thief and a traitor to the faith. Will's argument was one of pure pragmatic sweat equity. He argued that while John was the idea man, he was the one who had spent 26 years in the trenches. He was the one who had run the business, managed the books, perfected the production, and actually built the mail-order flake business. More importantly, he argued that his brother's Kellogg was associated with medicine, with enemas, sanitariums, and bland, joyless prescriptions. His Kellogg was a commercial product, a food for the masses. The lawsuit was a psychological battle for Will's very identity. He had spent his entire life being told he wasn't a real Kellogg, that he was the dull one, the flunky. Now his brother was trying to legally erase his name from the one success he had ever had. The quiet, gray-mustached bookkeeper became a lion. He poured his new company's profits not just into advertising, but into hiring the best lawyers in Michigan. He would not give in. The legal battle dragged on for over a decade, a proxy for their simmering fraternal hatred. The battle for Battle Creek was a local spectacle. Dr. John, with his vast resources and global fame, was confident he would crush his upstart brother. But in 1920, the Michigan Supreme Court delivered its final, stunning verdict. The court ruled in total favor of Will Keith Kellogg. The legal reasoning was a masterpiece of simple American pragmatism. The court ruled that while Dr. John may have invented the process, Will had created the business. And crucially, the court affirmed that a man's own signature is his personal property. This was Will's secret weapon. From his very first box of cornflakes in 1906, Will had, in a stroke of marketing genius, put his own flowing signature, W.K. Kellogg, on the front. This was not just branding, it was a legal declaration of independence. He was not selling Dr. Kellogg's medical flakes. He was selling W.K. Kellogg's commercial flakes. The court agreed. Will was granted the exclusive commercial rights to use the Kellogg name on cereal. Dr. John, the great man, the king, was humiliated. He was legally barred from using his own name on his own cereal products. He was forced to rename his company's flakes to obscure brands like Sanitarium Bran and Zwieback. Will had won. He had legally wrested his own identity from his brother. The 12-year million-dollar legal war was over. The two brothers, it is said, never fully reconciled. They would die as bitter enemies, two kings of the same town, ruling over two separate warring empires, John's empire of health and Will's new, rapidly expanding empire of profit. While this bitter family war was being fought in the courts, Will Kellogg was fighting his second public war against the reigning cereal king, C.W. Post. Post was the enemy Will could see. He was the ex-patient, the thief who had stolen Dr. John's ideas from the sanitarium and gotten rich. Post was a marketing gimmick genius. His grape nuts were a smash hit, thanks to wild pseudo-scientific ads claiming they could cure appendicitis and clear malaria, and most famously, build new brain cells. His cornflake knockoff, Post Toasties, was already on shelves, dominating the market. Will Kellogg, the quiet bookkeeper, now had to become a marketer. And it turned out he was a natural. He was not a snake oil salesman like Post. He was a brand builder. He understood that to win, he had to sell not just a product, but an idea. He poured every dollar he had, not into his factory, which he built in 1907, but into advertising. He launched the first massive national advertising campaigns in American history. His strategy was brilliant. He attacked Post's theft by emphasizing his own authenticity. The tagline was simple: the genuine toasted cornflakes. He put his signature on the box as a seal of genuineness. He also avoided Post's wild, unprovable medical claims, focusing instead on purity, taste, and health. He created one of the most iconic mascots in advertising history, the sweetheart of the corn. His boxes featured beautiful rosy-cheeked women in cornfields holding his product. This was not Dr. John's anti-aphrodisiacal health food. It was a vibrant, wholesome, and subtly appealing product. The cereal war between Kellogg and Post became an advertising arms race. Will pioneered the free sample, running a national ad campaign that told customers to wink at your grocer and see what you get. He invented the cereal box prize, inserting the funny Jungle Land moving pictures booklet to explicitly target children. He also targeted women directly with his famous Wednesday is Wife Saver Day campaign, arguing that cornflakes freed women from the drudgery of cooking a hot, greasy breakfast. Will Kellogg's strategy was a total success. He was out-marketing the marketer. The public, sensing the authenticity of his product and preferring his sugar-coated taste, began to abandon Post Toasties. By 1920, the year he finally won the lawsuit against his brother, Will Kellogg had also won the war against C.W. Post. Post himself, suffering from depression and illness, had died by suicide in 1914. The Kellogg Company was now the undisputed king of the cereal industry, controlling over 40% of the American market. With his two great wars won, Will Kellogg, now in his 60s, began to build his empire in earnest. He had his father-in-law's old patent for a new kind of health cereal, a pure wheat bran product. In 1916, he launched it as Kellogg's All Bran. It was an instant hit. He had brilliantly marketed his brother's digestive health concept for regularity, a polite euphemism for bowel movements. In 1928, he launched his next great innovation, Rice Krispies. This was a stroke of pure marketing genius. The product's selling point was the sound it made. In 1932, his ad agency created the three most famous mascots in the industry: Snap, Crackle, and Pop. This was the final definitive betrayal of Dr. John's legacy. Dr. John had created cereal as a medicine to stop stimulation. Will was now selling cereal as pure fun, a noisy cartoon character covered stimulant aimed directly at children. The growth was staggering, just as the outline described. The company's revenue exploded, growing 50 times over. The small $1 million a year venture of 1910 had become a $50 million a year global powerhouse by 1940. Will, unlike his insular brother, was a globalist. He began a massive international expansion. He built his first foreign factory in Canada in 1924. That same year, he opened his second in Australia. He then invaded Europe, opening a massive plant in Manchester, England in 1938. The sun, as they said of the empire, never set on a Kellogg's breakfast. His business strategy was total vertical integration. He controlled the cornfields in Michigan and Nebraska. He owned the printing plants that made his iconic red and green boxes. He owned the ad agencies. He controlled every step of the process, a strategy that cut his costs by 25% compared to his rivals. This absolute dominance inevitably attracted the attention of the U.S. government. The cereal war had not created competition. It had created an oligopoly. By the 1950s, the Big Three, Kellogg, Post, and their new rival General Mills, controlled almost the entire American breakfast market. The Department of Justice and the FTC launched investigations, accusing the companies of being a shared monopoly and engaging in anti-competitive practices. These legal challenges, which would flare up again in the 1970s, were a testament to Will's total success. He had not just won the cereal war, he had ended it, leaving a few giant victors to divide the spoils. By the time he stepped down, Will Keith Kellogg, the flunky, the janitor, was one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. He had built his kingdom of cornflakes, but it was a kingdom built on a foundation of profound personal tragedy. The brother who had given him his start was now his bitterest enemy. The religious faith he was raised in had been discarded for profit. The health food he had started with was now a sugar-coated, cartoon-covered commodity. The final ironic chapter of this family schism was written in their philanthropy. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the prophet, saw his own empire crumble. His beloved sanitarium, a temple of biologic living, was a financial dinosaur. It could not survive the Great Depression. In 1942, the San went bankrupt and was sold ignominiously to the U.S. Army to be used as a military hospital. John Harvey died a year later, in 1943, a man whose medical vision was largely dismissed as quackery, his business legacy a total failure. Will Keith Kellogg, the pragmatist, had the last laugh. In 1930, he, a man who had been paid $6 a week, established the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. He endowed it with the bulk of his massive $600 million fortune. It became and remains one of the largest and most powerful philanthropic foundations on earth. And, in a final symbolic act of fraternal separation, Will's foundation was dedicated not to his brother's religious or eugenicist obsessions, but to the practical, progressive cause of helping children. The two brothers, who had fought a 12-year legal war over their own name, had created two separate warring legacies that would outlive them by centuries. John's legacy of controversial medical fanaticism and Will's legacy of a global, sugar-coated industrial empire, the two dark secrets of the Kelloggs. The Michigan Supreme Court decision in 1920 was not just a legal verdict. It was a judgment of Solomon that cleaved the Kellogg dynasty in two. It was the moment of fission that created two separate warring legacies. When Will Keith Kellogg won the exclusive commercial rights to his own last name, he had legally and finally killed his identity as his brother's flunky. He was now W.K. Kellogg, the founder of the Kellogg Company, a man free to pursue his own destiny. And Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the king of Battle Creek, the man who believed he was the one true Kellogg, was left with his sanitarium, his radical medical theories, and a profound bitter resentment. The cereal wars were over. The two brothers, now ruling separate warring kingdoms from the same small Michigan town, would spend the rest of their lives building two vastly different and equally dark legacies. This was the great moral and ethical schism of the Kellogg family. Both brothers, in their own way, were building empires based on profound sins and abuses. Will, the pragmatist, would build a global empire of sugar, marketing, and commercial profit, a sin against the body that his brother had warned about. And John the prophet would dedicate his remaining years to a fanatical pseudo-scientific crusade to purify the human race, a quest built on medical abuse, racism, and eugenics, a sin against humanity itself. The first and more profitable sin was the sin of sugar. Will Kellogg's entire rebellion was founded on this single heretical act. Dr. John's original puritanical vision for the cornflake was that it was a medicine, a bland and aphrodisiacal food designed to prevent stimulation. Will's genius was to transform it into a recreation, a fun, sweet, stimulating food. This single act of adding sugar had created the modern breakfast industry. It also, critics would argue, for the next century had opened a Pandora's box of public health crises. Dr. John, in his fanatical anti-pleasure zeal, had accidentally been right. Sugar was a poison, at least in the quantities Will's new company would soon unleash upon the world. In the 1920s and 30s, the Kellogg Company was still, at least publicly, tied to the health narrative of its sanitarium origins. The ads for cornflakes, as detailed in reports from the Federal Trade Commission, still focused on health, vitality, and natural corn. But Will, the pragmatist, was already planting the seeds of a different strategy, one aimed not at the health-conscious adult, but at the pleasure-seeking child. His creation of Rice Krispies in 1928 and its iconic mascots, Snap, Crackle, and Pop, in 1932 was the first great shift. The cereal's primary selling point was not nutrition. It was fun, a noisy experience. But the true final betrayal of the health mission came after Will's retirement, when the company he had built was in the hands of his corporate successors. In 1952, they launched the product that represented the final total victory of Will's commercialism over John's fanaticism. They launched Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes. This was not health. This was candy disguised as breakfast. And with it came a new, friendly, and deeply manipulative salesman, Tony the Tiger. This was the perfection of Will's Snap, Crackle, and Pop strategy. The company was no longer marketing to the adults who bought the food. It was marketing directly to the children who demanded it. The cereal war had evolved. It was now a psychological war for the minds of American children, waged on the new powerful medium of television. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Kellogg, along with its rivals Post and General Mills, engaged in a sugar arms race. They launched Fruit Loops, Apple Jacks, and Frosted Mini Wheats. These were no longer grain products. They were sugar delivery systems, often containing 40 to 50% sugar by weight. The sin of Will Kellogg had been institutionalized. The Kellogg Company had become one of the key contributors to the American obesity epidemic and the crisis of type 2 diabetes, a charge that public health officials began to levy with increasing force in the late 20th century. The company that had been founded to cure digestive illness was now a primary cause of metabolic disease. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control would, by the 1960s and 70s, begin to note the alarming rise in childhood obesity, a trend that directly correlated with the rise of these high-sugar, heavily marketed breakfast foods. The government, which had been investigating the Cereal Trust for anti-competitive practices since the 1930s, finally began to act on the content of the products. In the 1970s, the FTC launched a massive multi-year investigation into the big three cereal makers. The charge was no longer just monopoly. It was deceptive and unfair advertising aimed at children. The FTC reports from this era were damning. They accused the companies of using sophisticated, cartoon-driven psychological warfare to sell sugar-laden products to children who had no concept of nutrition. They alleged that the company's relentless TV ad campaigns, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars, were unfair under the FTC Act because they exploited the vulnerability of young children. The cereal war, once fought over patents and trademarks, was now a legal and moral battle over the health of America's youth. This, then, was the dark legacy of Will Kellogg's commercial sin. He had won the war against his brother, but at the cost of the company's soul. But while Will was building an empire on the sin of sugar, his estranged brother, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, was building a very different and far more terrifying kingdom, an empire of eugenics. This was Dr. John's dark past. After losing the lawsuit in 1920, Dr. John, humiliated and barred from using his own name on his cereals, did not retreat. He doubled down. He still had his Battle Creek Sanitarium, his Temple of Health, and his global fame as a surgeon and health guru. He channeled all his prodigious obsessive energy into his true passion, a cause he believed was far more important than cornflakes: the purification of the human race. John Harvey Kellogg was one of the most prominent, powerful, and fanatical leaders of the American eugenics movement. Eugenics was a popular, progressive pseudoscience of the early 20th century, a movement embraced by elites from Ivy League presidents to Supreme Court justices. It argued that human society could be improved by better breeding. It advocated for encouraging the fit to reproduce and, critically, preventing the unfit from having children. For Dr. John, this was not a side hobby. It was the central theme of his entire medical philosophy. His obsession with diet, clean living, and most of all masturbation was all tied into this eugenicist worldview. In his infamous 500,000 copy-selling book, Plain Facts for Old and Young, Dr. John laid out his horrifying theories. He argued that self-abuse was the greatest cause of racial decay. He believed it drained the vital force from America's youth, leading to a degenerate race of weak-minded, sickly people. It was, in his view, a self-pollution that was destroying the purity of the race. His cures for this sin, which he advocated for in his book and practiced on his patients, were nothing short of medical torture. This was not just a conflict of interest. It was a profound abuse of his medical and religious authority. For young boys, he advocated circumcision without anesthesia, believing the brief pain would be a salutary punishment and a powerful deterrent. For more persistent cases, he advocated threading a silver suture through the foreskin, a painful wire designed to make erection impossible, a practice he claimed to have used on himself as a young man. For girls, he was even more brutal. He recommended the application of pure carbolic acid to the clitoris, chemically burning the nerve endings to destroy all capacity for unnatural pleasure. In extreme cases, he advocated for female genital mutilation. This was the man who had invented breakfast cereal. This was the prophet of health. In 1906, the same year Will founded his company, Dr. John founded his great life's work, the Race Betterment Foundation. This was the official heavily funded engine of his eugenicist campaign. From the headquarters of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, he hosted national conferences on race purity, bringing together the leading eugenicists of the day. But his work was not just theoretical. Dr. John, as the chief surgeon of the sanitarium, had the power to act on his beliefs. He was a leading advocate for forced sterilization. Michigan, like 30 other states at the time, had passed laws allowing the state to forcibly sterilize mental defectives and the feeble-minded. Dr. John was one of the policy's most enthusiastic practitioners. He sat on the Michigan Board of Health, which approved these sterilizations. According to his own records and reports from the Michigan Historical Society, he performed dozens of these operations, sterilizing patients, often young, poor, or immigrant women, whom he personally deemed unfit to reproduce. He was, in effect, using his medical authority to enact his racial purification theories on the vulnerable people in his care. This eugenicist worldview was also, as his biographer Howard Markel meticulously documented, inherently racist. The Battle Creek Sanitarium, the Temple of Health, was an exclusively white institution. Dr. John, who wrote extensively about racial decay, refused to admit African American patients. His vision of race betterment was for the betterment of the white race alone. This was the dark, parallel legacy of the Kellogg name. Dr. John's sin was not commercial like his brother's. It was a sin of fanaticism, a medical and moral abuse of power that used the language of health and religion to justify a campaign of racial and social purification. The internal legal war between the brothers, which had raged from 1907 to 1920, was in this light not just a fight over a trademark. It was a battle for the soul of the Kellogg name. Dr. John's legal argument was essentially a moral one. I am Dr. Kellogg, the man of science and health. He is Will, the flunky, and he is defiling my good name with his poisonous, sugar-coated product. He is committing a fraud against the public by associating his sin food with my health food. Will's legal argument was purely commercial. I am W.K. Kellogg. This is my signature. I built this business from nothing while he did nothing but sue me. I have the right to my own name, and I have the right to sell a legal product. When the Michigan Supreme Court ruled for Will in 1920, it was a landmark victory for commerce over ideology. The court did not care about the moral or religious implications of sugar. It cared about trademark law and individual identity. The verdict was a declaration that Will's new, commercial, sinful definition of Kellogg was the legally dominant one. Dr. John the prophet had been legally cast out of his own family's commercial legacy. This left only the final unresolved scandal, the labor practices of the new, victorious Kellogg Company. Will's corporation was not the fanatical, racist cult of his brothers, but it was a 20th century industrial powerhouse, and it ran on the same principles as its rivals. As noted by the Michigan Department of Labor in a 1925 report, the gleaming, cathedral-like Battle Creek factory was not without its dangers. Industrial accidents from the high-speed rollers, cutters, and packaging machines were a serious concern. Furthermore, a significant portion of the workforce, especially in the packaging departments, was low-wage female labor. This was a common industrial tactic. Women were paid a fraction of what men earned, a cost-saving measure that helped fund Will's massive multi-million-dollar advertising budgets. The sweetheart of the corn on the box was a wholesome, rosy-cheeked ideal. The reality for many of the women packing that box was a world of low pay and dangerous, repetitive industrial labor. This, then, was the divided, toxic legacy of the two brothers. They had started with a single, accidental invention, but their personal, bitter, and lifelong internal conflict had split the family's legacy. One brother, Dr. John, became a medical tyrant, abusing his religious and medical authority to advance a dark, racist, and eugenicist crusade. The other WK became a commercial titan, abusing the public's trust by marketing sugar-coated candy as health food, a move that would, in the long run, contribute to a national health crisis. The brothers, in their own ways, were both false prophets. John promised a pure race and Will promised healthy fun. Both, in the end, were selling a product that, as the 20th century would prove, was profoundly and dangerously toxic. The tragic end of the Kellogg brothers. While Will Kellogg's commercial empire conquered the globe, the personal lives of the two brothers disintegrated into tragedy. The legal victory that secured Will's company also cemented a lifelong, bitter estrangement. The final decades of the Kellogg dynasty were not defined by success, but by the slow, agonizing decline of Dr. John and the hollow personal losses of his victorious brother. This was the great schism of the Kellogg family. The two brothers, now ruling separate warring kingdoms from opposite ends of Battle Creek, would spend the rest of their long lives as bitter rivals, and their conflict was personal, philosophical, and total. Will, the pragmatist, had built a global empire of sugar, marketing, and commercial profit. John, the prophet, would dedicate his remaining years to a fanatical pseudo-scientific crusade to purify the human race. The final tragic disintegration of the Kellogg dynasty is the story of these two parallel warring legacies, a story of how two brothers, joined by blood but divided by ambition, spent their final decades trying to erase each other, both in life and in death. The first and most public tragedy was the slow, agonizing decline and fall of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. The 1920 lawsuit, which he had initiated, was a catastrophic, self-inflicted wound. The man who had for decades been the undisputed Dr. Kellogg of global fame was now legally barred from using his own name on his own invention. It was a humiliation from which his ego and his business would never recover. He, the prophet, was forced to watch as Will, the flunky, took his invention, perverted it with sugar, and used it to become one of the richest men in the world. Every red and green Kellogg's box that rolled off his brother's production line, every W.K. Kellogg signature on a national advertisement was a personal public insult. Dr. John, in his fury, tried to compete. He still had his own small company, the Battle Creek Food Company, the original health food business of the sanitarium. He continued to produce his own pure cereals, like Sanitarium Bran and Zwieback, but he was a prophet, not a businessman. He was certainly not a marketer. He was pathologically incapable of compromise. He refused to add sugar. He refused to use gimmicky cartoons or frivolous advertising. His cereals were, as they had always been, health foods, which meant they were bland, unappealing, and expensive. He was trying to sell penance in a box while his brother was selling pleasure. The result was a foregone conclusion. Will's company, fueled by a multi-million-dollar advertising budget, conquered the world. John's company, fueled by his own righteousness, languished and failed. It was a daily public humiliation played out on the grocery store shelves of America. But Dr. John still had his true kingdom, the Battle Creek Sanitarium. The San was his fortress, his temple of biologic living, the multi-million-dollar palace where he was still a king. It was a luxury health resort that for decades had attracted the richest and most famous people in the world: Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Amelia Earhart, J.C. Penney. They all flocked to Battle Creek to be cured by the great Dr. Kellogg, to submit to his bizarre, theatrical, and often torturous treatments, his ice water enemas, his yogurt douches, his electric light baths, and his 5-mile health marches. The San was not just a hospital, it was an experience. It had its own orchestra, its own grand dining halls, its own army of smiling nurses and uniformed staff. It was a monument to his massive ego, and the Great Depression destroyed it. The stock market crash of 1929 was the one enemy Dr. John's biologic living could not defeat. His clientele, the wealthy Gilded Age industrialists and socialites, were wiped out overnight. They no longer had the disposable income or the inclination to spend thousands of dollars on rest cures and yogurt enemas in Michigan. The San, with its massive overhead, its army of staff, and its orchestra, was a financial dinosaur, built for an era of excess that was now dead. While Will's company was, ironically, thriving in the Depression, his cheap 10-cent boxes of cornflakes were a staple food for a starving nation. John's luxury temple was bleeding money. Dr. John, the genius who had always mocked Will's janitor mind, was now revealed to be a catastrophically bad businessman. He was financially inept. He had poured the Sands' money into his other fanatical projects, particularly his Race Betterment Foundation. He had no cash reserves. He was, for the first time in his adult life, in debt. He tried to keep the San afloat, but the end was inevitable. In 1942, the Battle Creek Sanitarium, the University of Health, the grandest medical spa in the world, declared bankruptcy. The final humiliating blow came from the U.S. government. The U.S. Army, needing facilities to treat the flood of soldiers wounded in World War II, bought the entire 30-building complex for pennies on the dollar. The Temple of Biologic Living was immediately converted into the Percy Jones Army Hospital. The grand palm-filled lobbies where royalty had once promenaded were turned into triage wards. The hydrotherapy rooms, where Dr. John had practiced his water cures, were converted into surgical theaters. The San, his life's work, his monument, was now a military hospital, a place filled with the very blood, suffering, and unclean realities of the world he had tried so hard to purify. It was the ultimate symbolic death of his entire philosophy. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the king of Battle Creek, was now a king without a kingdom. He was reduced to running a small motel and health clinic in Florida, a shadow of his former self. He died 1 year later in 1943. He was 91 years old. He died a man whose medical genius was now almost universally dismissed as dangerous quackery, whose business legacy was a total failure, and whose very name was legally owned by the brother he despised. This was the end of the prophet. His personal dynastic line was just as barren. He and his wife Ella had no biological children. Dr. John's fanatical medical beliefs extended to his own marriage. He and Ella had, by all accounts, a completely celibate relationship, living in separate bedrooms for their entire lives. They had raised over 40 foster children, a generous act, but one that left him with no heir in the traditional dynastic sense. His branch of the Kellogg legacy, with all its eugenicist obsessions, was a biological and ideological dead end. While Dr. John's empire was crumbling, the empire of his brother, Will Keith Kellogg, was conquering the world. But this victory was, in its own way, just as riddled with personal tragedy. Will, the pragmatist, had won the war. He was now one of the richest men in the world. He was the serial king, but he was a king who ruled over a broken and tragically cursed family. The man who had spent his life battling his brother had, in the end, created an equally toxic dynamic with his own children. Will, who had been raised in the shadow of a genius brother, had no patience for weakness, especially in his own sons. His relationship with his son and chosen heir, John Leonard Kellogg, was a disaster. J.L. was not his father. He was not a ruthless businessman. He was, by all accounts, a quiet, sensitive, and bookish man, more interested in agriculture and biology than in advertising or production lines. Will, in a brutal echo of his own father, mistook this sensitivity for weakness. He forced J.L. into the company, grooming him for leadership, but he treated him with the same impatience and contempt that Dr. John had once shown him. The two men clashed constantly. Will saw J.L. as soft, indecisive, and not tough enough to run the empire. He would publicly humiliate his son in board meetings, undermining his authority. J.L., for his part, was often horrified by his father's ruthless, profit-at-all-costs business practices. This toxic father-son relationship culminated in the 1920s when Will, in a final heartbreaking act of rejection, forced JL out of the company. The very man who had built an empire out of his own rebellion against a domineering older brother had now done the exact same thing to his own son. The cycle of paternal rejection was complete. JL, estranged, moved to Australia to manage the family's assets there, effectively exiled. The family's string of tragedies felt almost biblical. Will's other son, Carl, suffered from severe health issues and was never a viable candidate for leadership. And the family's heirs seemed to be cursed. Two of Will's beloved grandsons died young, one in a plane crash. The Kellogg dynasty as a bloodline seemed to be disintegrating. And then came the final, cruelest irony. In the late 1930s, Will Keith Kellogg, the man who had built a global visual empire on the bright, colorful images of the sweetheart of the corn, began to go blind. He was suffering from advanced glaucoma. By the 1940s, the serial king, the man who had defeated C.W. Post and Dr. John, the man who had plastered his signature on billions of boxes, was almost completely blind. He was a blind king, a recluse, living out his final years at his vast winter estate in Pomona, California. A man who could hear his company's success on the radio, but could no longer see the empire he had built. This was the state of the Kellogg family in its final act. Two old, bitter, and isolated men. Dr. John, his empire in ruins. W.K., his family in tatters. They had lived in the same small town for over 40 years as warring neighbors. After the 1920 lawsuit, they had almost no contact. They died just 8 years apart, John in 1943, Will in 1951, as bitter enemies. But their final acts in life were their foundations, and these foundations were their final posthumous declaration of war against each other. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's legacy, the one he had tried to build, was his Race Betterment Foundation. This was his gift to humanity, a foundation built on the dark, pseudoscientific, and racist principles of eugenics. It was his plan to purify the human race by sterilizing the unfit and promoting the pure. It was a toxic, hateful, and fanatical ideology that, after his death, quickly and quietly faded into obscurity, an embarrassing evil footnote to his story. Will Keith Kellogg's legacy was the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. In 1930, at the height of the Depression, Will, now fantastically wealthy, placed the bulk of his $600 million fortune into this new foundation. It was, at the time, one of the largest philanthropic gifts in human history. The motive was the key. This was Will's final checkmating move against his brother. In a final symbolic and profound rejection of Dr. John's entire eugenicist worldview, W.K. Kellogg dedicated his entire fortune not to improving the race, but to helping children. Not the fit children, not the pure children, but all children, especially the vulnerable, the poor, and the disadvantaged, regardless of their race or fitness. The charter of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation was a direct, philosophical refutation of the Race Betterment Foundation. It was the ultimate, final refutation from the pragmatic brother. The dynasty of the battling brothers from Battle Creek was now, finally, over. It had left behind no unified family, no bloodline of heirs to fight over the spoils. The family, as a cohesive genes, was dead. The name Kellogg was now permanently split. There was the Kellogg Company, the commercial sugar-based empire, now run by a line of professional, non-family managers. There was the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, a separate, independent, philanthropic giant, one of the richest in the world, dedicated to social good. And then there was the other Kellogg, the ghost of Dr. John, a dark legacy of medical quackery, racism, and eugenics. The two brothers, in their lifelong bitter war, had ensured that the Kellogg dynasty would never be a dynasty at all. There were no heirs, no shared vision, no united family. There were only two warring legacies, born from a single accidental fermented batch of wheat.